before you can start to do some housekeeping, right, you have to remove the bellow, right, as well as the you can see that there's an indicator ring that I've designed using 3D design and 3D printing. That has to be removed before you can actually access to the collar. And the ring that I've designed is actually pretty tight fit, so you don't have to use any screw to screw the ring together, right? And be very careful when you screw or unscrew the collar, because the screw threads are very delicate, and the screw threads is the only way that you can actually move the collar up and down. And while you move the collar up and down, this is the only way you can adjust the height at which the burr will be brought closer or away from each other, and in that way the grind size can be adjusted. And the screw threads are actually made in aluminium, and they are pretty soft, so when you unscrew or screw back the collar, please be very cautious, because the warranty does not cover the wear and tear parts such as the screw thread on the collar, and that's not part of the cover by the factory. So if you have damaged the screw thread by yourself, you have to spend money on your own pocket to get it repaired. Hello everyone, this is CY once again. Today I'm going to show you the reason why we need to align the burr set on the DF64 flat burr grinder, right? Okay, usually we should do this before you started using the grinder. That will be the best time to do it. However, most of us are too excited to get started on the grinder, and if you have already used your grinder, right, the only thing you need to do is actually to give your grinder a deep clean, so that all the coffee ground and the coffee stain will be removed before you start to align the grinder, right? So you can see right now I'm actually unscrewing all the screws to remove the burrs, so that I can clean the burrs from all the coffee powder. One of the reasons why we need to align the burr is the burr, usually the Itamil burrs are rather flat on the back surface, but the burr carrier and the burr housing, when the factory machine the burr housing and the burr carrier, they may not be perfectly flat. So when the two burrs are grinding the coffee ground, they are not perfectly parallel to each other, and when that happens, right, usually they will produce more inconsistent coffee ground, and that's the reason why we have to do the burr alignment. And before you start to do the burr alignment, you have to check several things, right? And I'll be showing the first thing that we're going to check before we start to do the burr alignment, right? Of course, now if you already use your grinder, right, you can see that most of the time I'm doing here is just cleaning up the entire grinder. There's a lot of coffee ground that's stuck in the position where the screws are, so you can use a toothpick or something like that to actually clean out the coffee ground, right? If you are afraid of using the hex key that I'm using right now, you can always use a toothpick, right? A bamboo or a wooden toothpick will do, right? And a brush like this is going to be very useful, right? So you can brush out all the coffee ground, right? A portable vacuum is also very handy, right? I will not recommend using a very powerful vacuum cleaner. The reason is because I actually accidentally vacuumed the screws into the powerful vacuum cleaner, and a hard time retrieving the screws which has been sucked into the vacuum dust bag. So I recommend just using a portable one, which is enough to remove all the coffee ground and not strong enough to remove the screws. And you can see that the part that usually comes most aligned is the bottom burr, right, where the burr set is actually attached to the motor, right? That burr is usually quite flat, and normally the problem is always the upper burr and the upper burr carrier can give us a problem. And the upper burr carrier is actually supported by 3 springs, and it is very important that we properly install the 3 springs. If not, no matter how you align your burr, you will not get a very well aligned burr set, right? We don't have to get it totally parallel to each other, right? But we try to get it parallel as much as possible. Hence, therefore, it's important to clean out all the coffee ground, right, before you start the burr alignment, right? And especially where the spring are being installed, right? There's these 3 silicone tube that hold the spring, right? You will see it later in the video, right? So you can see currently I'm actually trying to clean the lower burr set, which is actually screw on to the motor, right? This part you don't have to worry too much, right? Because most of the time this is the more well aligned one. So I'm just unscrewing all the screws so that I can remove the lower burr sets, and then to actually clean out all the coffee ground that's stuck there. And the lower burr is actually quite deep inside, so it is usually quite hard to access all the way to the bottom, clean up all the coffee ground. So I will usually lift up the grinder, and I'll just leave it upside down. Then I'll use the paintbrush to clean off, to dust off all the coffee ground that's trapped inside there. Right, at the same time, you can do some house cleaning on the outside as well. Right, but be careful if you are going to leave the grinder upside down, because the grinder is actually pretty heavy. Right, I think in terms of weight, it is probably heavier than the niche grinder. Right, so you can see now I'm actually inverting it. So hold it tight, don't let it drop, otherwise it may cause dent to the collar whereby the screw threads are, and if the screw threads are damaged, it will actually affect your grind setting and grind adjustment, because the entire grind adjustment is actually depends on the screw thread when you screw the collar on, and that's how you adjust the grind setting. So always be careful, right, with the screw threads, because that's the only way to actually screw down the collar whereby you can adjust the grind setting. And there's also one position which you have to clean up, which is actually where the coffee ground is being expelled through a chute. This chute is a very tiny hole, and the tiny hole is always being stuck with a lot of coffee ground. And if you start to use the grinder with oily beans or medium to medium dark coffee beans, then this part will be more easily closed up, and ends up your coffee ground will be very hard to be expelled as you grind the coffee beans, right? So as a suggestion, before you use the grinder, right, I would recommend using light roasted coffee, right, to grind through first, so that the light roasted coffee will act like a talcum powder to actually coat, do a little coating on the exit chute area, and so that in the future when you grind other type of coffee, you will pass by the coffee exit, the chute exit more easily, right? So that's only my recommendation, right? So from my experience and from my friend's experience, Jeffrey is actually my friend who actually taught me all this. So he recommended that I use uh, light roasted coffee beans. And one of the most important thing don't that you shouldn't forget is actually to unplug your grinder before you do all these things, right? Because you don't want to accidentally trigger the switch and the grinder will be turned on, and that is actually very dangerous. So always make sure that it's unplugged. Now I'm actually installing the lower burr onto the motor, because now all the coffee ground has been cleaned off. So now you can install it back, and very soon I'll be showing you how the first thing you should make sure, right, before you actually do the burr alignment, right, because if the spring is not properly installed, then there's no point doing the burr alignment. Right, after all the screw has been screwed on and the lower burr is actually properly secured onto the motor, now we can actually move on to make sure that the spring is properly installed, right? This is the silicone tubing that's actually surrounding the, or providing a housing for the spring. Right, you have to ensure that the spring is flush with the bottom of the silicone tubing, so that when you insert, the silicone tubing will be all the way down, touching at the bottom of uh, the burr carrier, right? So you have to push all the way down, right? Ensure the silicone tubing is all the way down, right? So this is a very important step, because you don't want the tubing to be halfway, and when the top burr is being pressed down against the lower burr, right, it will actually try to affect the ability of the spring to spring back. So this is something that you have to ensure. Right now you can see that I'm gonna do a first test, right? This first test is actually very important. The first test I will be using a water-based marker, right? In this case I'm using blue color to top up all the flat part of the burr set, right, on both top burr and the bottom burr, right? So this is what we call the first test. This is actually to test whether the during the factory installation of the burr, is the burr already properly aligned. So later on you will see that I will try to screw the burr back, the collar back, right, and I'll try to allow the two burr to touch each other, so that I'll find out whether how much of the marker is being wiped off, right? The more percentage that the marker is wiped off, the better will be the burr set, the better or the will be the alignment of the burr, right? So later on you'll see the result of this, and you have to be very careful, right, when you screw down the collar, right? There's only one entry point for the screw to lock in, right? You have to find the locking point or the entry point for your own grinder, right? For my grinder it is roughly around the 8 o'clock position. So normally I will align my 90, the grind setting 90 on the collar to align at the 8 o'clock position, and I'll try to locate the entry point for the thread, right? So if you do this, you have a you'll be less prone to damaging the thread, because if you messed up the thread by screwing unevenly onto the collar or onto the screw thread, this will actually damage the thread. And do remember that if you're doing this, the factory warranty does not cover this if you damage it on your own, right? So you can see that I'm trying to press down to find the entry point, right? But once you locate the entry point to the thread, it'll be very easy for you to screw. So for the first time you do this, it'll be quite difficult, but don't worry, you can just use your 90 position, try to find where's the entry point. And for my particular grinder, the one that you're seeing now, the entry point is around the 8 o'clock. From my experience, the entry point is usually around the 8 o'clock or the 9 o'clock position. You will probably hear a click sound, right, when you locate the entry point, and that will be once you locate the click sound and you start to turn clockwise, the thread will be screwed in, and the collar will not be pop up anymore. And as you can see, this is my first time trying to locate the entry point, or we call it the 0 point, where the thread actually screw in. So be patient, right? This will be once you locate it, it'll be much easier. And it's always good to prime the spring once in a while to make sure all the springs are equally depressed, right? So that they will have the full spring ability. Yeah, so that in later when you do the alignment, you'll be better, right? I think it's good to hold in my case, because I know roughly the entry point is at 8 o'clock, so you will hold your hands around at the 8 o'clock and the 2 o'clock position, and if you press down and turn, it'll be much easier to locate and to screw in. And you can see that there's no need to plug in power to test the alignment. My power cable is totally plugged off. I'll just be using my fingers to turn the motor, right? And usually you will need to turn 4 complete revolution before the burrs are close enough to touch each other, right? And as you can see, once in a while I'll press down the middle metal collar, so that this is to prime the spring, so that the springs will be in good position, right? So you can see that as I do micro adjustment in the clockwise position, I try to use my finger to turn the motor, right, to see whether the burr sets are actually touching each other, right? Once it touch each other, you can feel the slight resistance, and you just give it a spin, and it's good to go, right? This time the 2 burr sets are already touching each other, and once it happens, you can just unscrew the collar and to remove and to see whether how many percent of the marker has been wiped off. It'll be quite hard to see the marker, how many percent of the marker has been wiped off from the video, so I will usually take a photo after I've done the first step, and from the photo I can keep a record of how many percent of the burr is being wiped off. So you can see in the upper burr set, only about 20 to 30% of the marker has been wiped off, which is around the 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock position. So this burr is actually very poorly aligned, because about 70% to 80% of the marker remain unwiped off, right? So they stay on. So now let's look at the lower burr set, right? If you look closer at the lower burr, right, you can see that most of the 2 sides are being wiped off, and the remaining that's not wiped off is probably due to the misalignment of the top burr, right? So from here you can see that the lower burr set is actually more well aligned as compared to the upper burr set. Alright, this is where I'll end my video, and please look forward for the next one where I do the proper burr alignment. This is CY once again. Please remember to subscribe to my channel, like my videos, and